So, we're now going to move on to our first keynote speaker. It's the Right Honourable John McDonnell MP, who's of course Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer. So please welcome Mr McDonnell to the stage.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation from the Federation. Let me assure you the Federation is a strong voice on your behalf in government and to all political parties in the House of Commons. It speaks with a strong voice because it experiences the real world that you live in and that you operate in. So as we develop our policies, both in government and opposition, it tells us what you need, what government should be doing, and yes, sometimes brings us down with a bump into the real world every now and again. So I'm grateful for the work that they do. We're meeting in a period when we've just had the publication of the industrial strategy. We're a few weeks ahead of the budget and also possibly more significantly Article 50 in its passage through the House of Commons and the House of Lords, which will begin the process of leaving the European Union. So I want to concentrate on Brexit, the industrial strategy and the budget. Labour voted to give the government the authority to begin that process of leaving the European Union, but we haven't given them a blank cheque. The next 2 years or more will involve intense negotiations and scrutiny of the government, and it will involve a debate, I believe, a national conversation about the kind of society and the kind of economy we want to live in. Now, amongst all the many interpretations of the vote to leave the EU, it's clear to all sides that actually it was a vote for change. The status quo is no longer an option. I toured all around the country in areas that voted remain and leave. But the message was clear. We have to do things differently from the past. And actually, yes, one clear message as well in many of those areas was that there needs to be a recognition once more that the securing of our manufacturing sector is the key to securing the prosperity of our wider economy. So let me make it clear, Labour will place support for our manufacturing sector at the centre of its approach to Brexit and at the heart of its economic policy making. But it was obvious before the Brexit vote that our economy was not functioning as it should. Productivity has stagnated. Since the crash, to be frank, it's been too easy for some employers to substitute cheap labour for capital investment. So the result has been a proliferation of jobs, but a collapse in wages. Real hourly pay is still 10% below its level a decade ago. Mark Carney, the Governor of the Bank of England, has called this the lost decade for living standards. It's actually unprecedented in British history since the Industrial Revolution. And you know as well as I do, with prices set to rise as the fall in the value of the pound feeds into the economy, the squeeze on living standards for many families will be tighter over the coming year. So it's Labour's belief that if we're going to have to prosper as a country after Brexit, we need a sharp change in economic direction. If we're to create a fairer and a more prosperous economy after Brexit, that means manufacturing will have to have a central place. Because it's manufacturing, and you know this better than me, that reliably creates the well-paid, secure jobs, and they need not be concentrated in just a few hotspots, but spread throughout the country. For many of those communities who voted to leave, it's been 30 years of neglect and decline, of seeing solid jobs in manufacturing and industry replaced by work that's too often insecure and poorly paid. And we shouldn't tolerate a situation any longer where a few privileged centres grow at the expense of the rest of the country. The decade since the financial crisis has drummed home this point. The crisis was centred, yes, on a catastrophic failure of a few London-based institutions. Management was poor, regulations failed to work as they should, and the bonuses paid out by major financial firms didn't end up being spent in Hull or Stoke or Copeland. They stayed in London. And when the bubble burst, the whole country had to carry the losses. The profits went to a few, but the pain of austerity has been felt by the many. Parts of the country that never have been part of the good times during the bubble were now being asked to cover the costs. And they've paid. They've paid over the last 7 years. It should be no surprise that for many in those forgotten places, those that felt left behind, they took the chance to give the system a kick. That kick contributed to the Brexit vote. Like many of you, Labour campaigned to stay in the EU. We argued that the risks of an exit, particularly under this government, were too great. And actually, we delivered 7 out of 10 Labour supporters in that vote to remain. But the vote was to leave, and we've respected that decision as a fundamental democratic choice. But it's essential that we fight for the best possible Brexit, one that protects jobs and living standards above all else. People, yes, they voted to leave the EU, but I don't believe they voted to lose their job or trash the economy. So we've insisted, as soon as the vote was declared, that the government observe clear red lines in its negotiations with the EU. And these are to protect jobs and living standards. And I think it's essential now that we seek to develop a broad national consensus on how the negotiations should be conducted. If we believe that manufacturing is essential to securing a fairer and more prosperous economy after Brexit, that consensus on negotiations should place the needs of manufacturing at its centre. And we seek a bipartisan approach politically on that centrality of manufacturing. So Labour is absolutely committed to securing the fullest possible access to the single market for goods. The case for a comprehensive trade agreement with the EU that would continue to allow manufacturers here to access European markets at minimum cost is overwhelming. The damage done not only to the markets for final output, but to extended European-wide supply chains by failure to secure this deal could be enormous. UK manufacturers are rightly connected and tightly connected to European supply chains. Of the goods and services we export, 23% of their value is accounted for by imports needed to make them. It's far higher in this country than in countries like Japan or the US, where just 15% of exports value depends on imports. Imposing tariff barriers would tear up those extended supply chains. Yet some in government appear to believe they can, if pushed, simply walk away from whatever deal is on the table in favour of the fallback option of the WTO. Not only are the costs, particularly to manufacturers like yourselves, likely to be high, negotiations over the WTO schedules will still entail a lengthy process of discussion with the EU and others. As a negotiation position, these attempts to play hardball, we believe, simply will not work. It's a bluff, and it will be seen as a bluff across Europe. We believe it's far better to adopt an approach that, whilst the UK has voted to leave, we want the best possible relationship with our European partners to continue. It will be a different relationship, of course, but it cannot be one based on mutual distrust. Later this week, the Labour Party is hosting a conference in London of European social democratic parties to discuss Brexit and the EU. A process of discussion and mutual agreement, where possible, is far better, we believe, than the phony tough posturing adopted by the government at the moment. And that's the approach to negotiations we favour. It's on the basis of a recognition of mutual interests that I think we can secure the best possible access to the single market for goods. And there will be trade-offs, of course. But if the aim is to protect jobs and living standards in the UK, the widest possible single market access for goods is the best available outcome for us all. And that applies to the whole of the manufacturing sector. Labour does not believe in creating special deals for favoured parts of the economy. So we need a trade deal that works for the whole of manufacturing. Any future deal with the EU should seek to keep tariffs on goods where they presently are, 0, as in the existing customs union arrangements. There is no good case to be made in favour of tariff walls between European countries at similar levels of development, particularly where the supply chains might be placed at risk. Now, we recognise that with more than half the UK's now going to exports now going to the rest of the world, whatever opportunities exist to strike specific deals would also need government to deal with the risks of leaving the customs union. I think we should maintain a sense of realism about the immediate possibilities. Signing comprehensive free trade deals will be a long process, since it's essential to get the details right. Government ministers, in our view, should not encourage illusions that quick deals will be best for Britain. It's more important that we get the right deal than to get a quick deal. And we want a future trading system and trade deals that will allow manufacturers the freedom to establish their own supply chains and open new markets whilst protecting jobs and rights in the UK. And let me say now as well, as part of that freedom, Labour will continue to support the right of British manufacturers to employ whoever they think is best for the job. EU migrants have made and will continue to make a huge contribution to this country. And in particular, we know that many of you rely heavily not only on skilled workers from across the continent, but also on less skilled labour. And the ability for manufacturing employers in particular to tap into this pool of labour is an obvious strength for them. But the right of freedom of movement that creates this strength will be directly challenged by Brexit. So what Labour favours is fair rules and reasonable management of migration in the best interests of the economy and society overall. I have to say to us, as a bargaining position, the government's posturing on this issue makes little sense. There are 1.5 million British citizens resident in the rest of the EU whose rights can in turn be put in jeopardy. Our European partners understand this, and they won't be swayed by attempts at tough talk from London. The sooner this situation is resolved constructively, with a clear and unambiguous statement that EU migrants currently resident here will have their rights protected, the sooner the negotiation process can move on constructively. That's not only the principled position to take, it's the most popular position as well. And also, it's economically the most sensible, since it guarantees those currently in work can remain in work and plan for the future. So the challenge in Brexit is not only how we approach the negotiations, it's also how we transform our economy, our domestic economy. And yes, it's been pleasing to see some movement from government's rhetoric on the economy over the last year. The recognition that a modern industrial strategy will be central to how governments conduct economic policy, we welcome. The recent Green Paper, though, fell far short of what was required and what we hoped for. It offered plenty of evidence of the need for a strategy, some of it absolutely damning. The major global trends are now clear. After years of declining manufacturing employment across the developed world, reshoring is now well established. 1 in 6 manufacturers now report bringing some production back to the UK, and it's clear why this is happening. Proximity to major markets and access to skilled labour are both prerequisites to manufacturing success today. But the economies that are navigating this switch are those with governments prepared to properly support their manufacturing sector. When the steel crisis broke out last year, governments across the developed world moved quickly to intervene. The US increased some tariffs on Chinese steel to 266%. Germany increased its subsidies. Italy even nationalised a producer. At the EU level, attempts were made to impose tariff barriers against the dumping of cheap steel. In all these cases, governments recognised the need to move swiftly and defend a foundational industry. It is simply not possible to run a modern developed economy without a steel industry. And whilst the crisis in British steel has eased, significant uncertainties remain. A comprehensive industrial strategy, we believe, would place steel and other foundational industries like chemicals at its centre. And it's no longer good enough post-Brexit for government to hide behind state aid rules as an excuse for shoulder shrugging. This government, like others in the developed world, should be prepared to intervene to support essential production. That means action on procurement to supply chains, to sustain supply chains and create markets, using government's own purchasing power to buy domestic steel and industrial products. But it's not just defending existing and essential industries. It means supplying the cheap, long-term loan finance that meet the potential of our smaller firms. That's why Labour is committed to setting up a national investment bank and regional development banks charged with delivering finance to small and medium-sized firms in particular. And it echoes what's happening across Europe as well. The inability of smaller firms to access the finance they need for growth has held back their potential. And the concentration of lending by existing financial system in London has meant the rest of the country has lagged behind. We will correct that bias. We want to see small firms, especially in manufacturing, across the whole of the country. We can build on the success that's already out there, that you've delivered, and we can develop a British Mittelstand, a high investment, high productivity, smaller firms that provide high quality employment in those sectors where we have the greatest potential, like high value added manufacturing. There's the potential here, as the fourth industrial revolution gets underway, for a manufacturing renaissance that can transform the potential not of those places and regions already succeeding, but also those areas that have been left behind for too long. And yes, as you've mentioned in the various reports that have been produced by the Federation, training and skills are an essential part of that. Over a third of manufacturers are still struggling to recruit because applicants lack the relevant qualifications. We supported the apprenticeship levy because we recognise that high-quality training requires funding. But like you, we've raised concerns about how it has been applied and more generally about the quality of the training provided. There are steps to be taken here in tightening up the provision and monitoring the apprenticeship training. That includes ensuring that the new Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education is up and running promptly. And more generally, the approach from government has to recognise that vocational and more academic training enjoy parity of esteem. There is no place, and I speak from someone who left school and went straight onto the shop floor, there's no place in a modern economy for the old blue-collar versus white-collar distinction. This isn't simply about equality, it's hard-nosed recognition of the fact that advanced manufacturing requires advanced skills. So yes, Labour is developing its own industrial strategy as part of our new economic offer. The responses to our consultation so far have been overwhelming and positive, and as we move forward and develop policy, we want to make sure you're all involved at every step of the way. Let me just turn to the budget. This year's budget is, as you know, due in 3 weeks. It could be an opportunity for the government to address the concerns of our manufacturing sector. I have to say, unfortunately, the signs so far are not particularly promising. A small amount of additional funding was pledged for public investment by the Chancellor in the autumn statement, but this was not even close to matching the levels required to drive up research and development spending to the levels, well, of our competitors, successful manufacturers like Germany or Sweden, and it scarcely undid the damage of the £1 billion real terms cuts in R&D spending the previous Chancellor had allowed. So Labour is committed to achieving the OECD target of 3% of GDP spent on R&D from all sources. We're committed to keeping in place those mechanisms that help the private sector, like R&D tax credits, and will make good any loss in EU funding for research whilst pushing for a deal that maintains essential European-wide research and safety arrangements, and that includes UK membership of Euratom. But we also recognise that serious long-term commitments to research, and especially on the development and application of scientific research, will require public funding. So that commitment to invest goes further. Broadband provision in Britain remains inadequate for a modern, developed economy still. It has to be considered an essential part of the modern infrastructure. So we're committed, Labour's committed to the delivery of a fully fibre optic broadband connectivity across the whole country. As part of our commitment to investment, we will in government deliver the funding needed to accelerate fibre to the premises, prioritising areas of clear business need. Let me just turn finally to the business rates. You know as well as I do, the business rate system is frankly a mess. The revaluation of rates has been exceptionally poorly handled, landing unfair and unsustainable increases in business rates on smaller businesses. The instability of periodic, sudden revaluations creates instability that is debilitating for many businesses. Rates need to be adjusted in a way that gives businesses more predictability. The current system also penalises businesses, like many of you, for investing in the machinery and other capital that our economy desperately needs. And that's self-defeating and out of line with other countries, and the Federation has repeatedly made this point to government. It's exactly the very opposite of what a tax system should do. Also, the clampdown on appeals is unfair as it leaves businesses without recourse when rates are valued unfairly. So the government have repeatedly cut corporation taxes while leaving our business rate system in disarray, and this disproportionately helps the largest businesses and harms the smallest. So yeah, Labour's supporting the call for an overhaul of the business rates to help manufacturing, and we'll be bringing forward our own proposals ahead of this year's budget, and hopefully the government will be listening to all of us about the need for change. Let me conclude then. The years ahead will be, yes, challenging for this country, but yeah, they'll also contain opportunities. But if we're to take them, we can't settle for the status quo. If we want to continue to prosper as a society and make sure that prosperity is more fairly shared, the old rules of the economy have to be rewritten. And manufacturing has to be central to that transformation. I repeat, it's where the high-quality, secure, well-paid jobs will be found for the future. It's the lever by which we can lift all parts of this country into sharing wider prosperity. But yes, it will need a government prepared to intervene and support that sector. So I repeat the commitment I've given to the Federation previously. We will work with the Federation and with you, its members, to ensure that we develop an industrial strategy, a new relationship with Europe, and also a fair distribution of investment across this country to ensure that manufacturing enters into that new renaissance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Mr McDonnell's kindly agreed to take some questions as well. I'm just going to kick off with one to start while you're having a little think of what you want to ask. You talked there about the challenges the manufacturing sector faces and the uncertainty we have at the moment. If you were Chancellor tomorrow, what would be the first thing you would do to help this sector? Yeah, I'll let you.
The key elements of our representations at the autumn statement, and well, to be frank, since I became Shadow Chancellor September before last, is about long-term, stable, patient investment in our economy, in which the private sector can recognise that the government is investing stably and it can match fund a lot of that investment. But that investment should actually be fairly distributed across the country. Some of the distribution of infrastructure investment at the moment is shocking, whereby you can have something like £3,000 per head in capita invested in London, the home counties, and £400 in the North East. So it is about government working with you to identify those projects where it needs long-term, stable, patient investment, infrastructure and skills. It's your agenda that you've put to us that we want to see implemented in government. We cannot have this continuous stop-start around investment that's gone on. That's why, exactly as the earlier speaker said, that's why in productivity terms we've fallen behind, because we haven't had that investment, infrastructure and skills. And I just say on the issue with regard to the business rates issue, I'm hoping that in this budget, this issue about R&D tax reliefs is actually properly addressed, and that we don't get into a situation where people are actually not gaining the benefits from R&D within the taxation system. That's been one of the key demands from the Federation that we've supported throughout.
Okay, let's take some questions. You might want to stand there, Mr McDonnell, because I don't think we've got a mic over there. Yeah, well, gentlemen at the front, we'll take 3 questions. If anyone else wants to pop their hands up for a question. Yes.
Thank you. Andrew Churchill from JJ Churchill. You talked about our economy's over-reliance on creation of a large number of low-paid jobs. And almost in the same breath, the chronic lack of reinvestment in innovation and capital equipment to drive that. Is it your thesis then that there's a link, there's a nexus between easy access to labour from Europe and the free movement of people, and perhaps my sector's underinvestment in innovation?
The issue that we've got is one in which it's almost a mathematical certainty that if you don't invest in capital, you don't invest in skills training, etc., and you rely upon cheap labour, productivity stagnates. It's mathematical certainty. What we need is a government. The government said it has a long-term economic plan. For the last 7 years, we've not seen that. We needed much earlier than some of the statements in the current industrial strategy green paper. What we needed some time ago, and we've been calling for it, is a strategy that recognises that if we are to thrive in a modern global economy, we have to raise skills and we have to invest, and we have to have stable investment in both. And because there's been no development of that strategy from government in particular, what's happening is we've plugged the gap with cheap labour. The interesting thing is I've been touring around speaking to different developers and others, is that we're importing skilled labour because we haven't got the skills in this country. This government's been in power for 7 years. You and the Labour Party and others have been banging the drum for investment in skills. And only now we're seeing any form of movement or acknowledgement of that, and much too little, too late. So we should not be seeking to develop an economy now which is reliant on imported cheap labour. Well, the whole purpose of, I think, this development of the new economy post-Brexit will be to develop the skills which will be based upon long-term stable investment, both in our human capital as well as our infrastructure capital, and that's the way forward. If we continue to rely upon this cheap labour economy, not only do we not compete in terms of productivity, but actually we have a divided society. And if you look at all the reports about the inequality within our society at the moment, you can see how that Brexit vote came about in some areas around the country. The stark inequality, both on a regional basis and, yes, on a basis of the incomes of people that have been developed over the last 20 to 30 years. That has to be addressed, and it can only be addressed by a government that intervenes, stably invests in both our human capital and our infrastructure capital.
On that point of skills, I remember when I was starting out as an engineer, I was 19, Labour were in power, and there was a massive skills shortage then. So you talk about it being a long problem, but this has been going on for years, the lack of young people in science and engineering.
It has. Also, it's been going on for years, but also it's been well established in our culture. The cultural aspects of our economy, well, all of you know this, that people were going off to university and to doing individual courses that were unrelated to the needs of our economy, and actually going into that apprenticeship or working on the shop floor, there was that divide between white and blue collar. There was a lack of parity of esteem in terms of what you did as a career. Now, I think all of us have recognised that, and what we're trying to do now is to change the whole culture of our economy. So actually, and you know as well as I do in Germany and elsewhere, that's not the case. There's a recognition about someone going into engineering, into manufacturing. It has a status that we lost in this country. We did have it for a period, and then it's lost. So yes, it is a long-term trend, and that's what we've got to address now. That's why I welcome the government's industrial strategy paper, because only up until last autumn, the use of the words industrial strategy was completely rejected at the heart of government. I think part of your lobbying, but also societal change, has meant the government has got to address that. But as I say, it's too little too late at the moment, and that's part of the discussion that we've got to have. It is about cultural change.
So can you see a day when there's a parity of esteem between a young person who goes to do an apprenticeship in an engineering company or with some person who's going off to do the uni?
We've got to make it. We, in this debate that's coming up about the future of our economy, we've got to set that as a goal. And I think that's achievable. As I say, when I left school, I went straight on the shop floor. And it was at that point in time you could get apprenticeships. You do the traditional apprenticeship, and you would earn a decent wage, and there was an element of respect within working-class families. My mum, God rest her soul, still says to me, when are you going to get a proper job? Because my dad was a docker, but actually my uncle was one of them was a bricklayer, stepfather was a bricklayer, my uncle was a carpenter, another electrician, another a plumber. And that gave you security virtually for life as a working class family and a decent standard of living. And you were respected within your own community because you had those skills. I think a lot of that is now gone. So what we've got to do is transform that. And it is about the new technologies, of course, as well, the fourth industrial revolution. So it is cultural change. But I think we're on the cusp of that cultural change. And I just come back to it. It is part of the thing that you've been lobbying for as a federation for so long as well.
We've got two questions here. First of all, we'll take number two and then Terry.
Paul Jackson from Engineering UK. Can I pick up on those themes of reaching out to young people and the apprenticeship levy? Yeah. We're hearing from companies that they are finding it very difficult to use the apprenticeship levy money because it's very tight what it can be used for, particularly in the supply chain. And they would like to use it to reach out into education and to work with their local schools. They can't do that. And for some companies, Arm Holdings is a great example, where actually their supply chain is really the people supply chain that then goes into the intellectual property. They would really like to see more science teachers helping them. Would you do something about relaxing those rules on the use of the apprenticeship levy? And perhaps we could have a one-time change in diversity, because we could attract people into manufacturing and into engineering at 16, where everybody studies the same subjects through to that age.
Yeah. If you can get the message across to Greg later on when he comes, because I think his heart's in the right place. This is the dilemma, this is the irony of this, that the apprenticeship, the training levy and the apprenticeship scheme seems to be focused on volume rather than quality, numbers rather than what's actually needed in some instances. So there needs to be greater flexibility. Now, I've spoken and met so many firms, it's just the Federation, it's the Chamber, the FSB, the CBI, and individual companies need more flexibility in this application. Because yes, it's all well and good setting targets on numbers, but actually it's the quality as much as the numbers that we need. But here's the other irony on all of this as well. At the same time, the training levy is meant to be investing in the development of skills. We're seeing the biggest cut in school budgets since we've seen since the 1970s. And there's a conflict there. You cannot expect the training skills to be developed through a training levy if the education system isn't delivering at an early stage. So I agree with you. We've pressed for greater flexibility. I think government may well have to recognise that in the coming period. This rush to achieve implementation on numbers without, I don't think, full and adequate consultation in the designing of the scheme, and without putting flexibility in there, I think is a contradiction and will not achieve the objectives that the government has set. But again, I just say to you, press Greg as well, because we can't have this situation where school budgets are being cut on the scale that they are at the moment, because that will undermine the foundations upon which we eventually want to develop those skills in later life.
Okay, let's take a final question from Terry.
John, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for your well-delivered speech. John, it's fair to say that you and I don't agree on everything across the economy. And when we spoke a couple of days ago, I think I mentioned to you the challenge from our point of view was that there's a credibility gap between industry and the current front bench and shadow cabinet. Do you think that your speech this morning has closed that credibility gap?
I'm under 3 rules at the moment from Jeremy Corbyn. 1 is watch my language. 2 is no jokes. And 3, no more throwing about little red books. I don't know whether that speech has had any attempt at building a credibility gap. I just say this to you. There'll always be an open door to the Federation in terms of the Labour Party. Always has been and there always will be. You bring a practical experience to our discussions about policy that we desperately need. And it comes at a time when you and I and all of us and politicians have to recognise that people want change. I've been doing these regional economic conferences all around the country. I've been sending out my economic advisors all around the country to hold seminars and lectures and conferences on the economy and how we move forward. Now, you would think these are dry subjects, and my advisors range from Joe Stiglitz right the way across to people who are just specialising in a particular area on digital economy or something like that. You would think that these were dry subjects and people would not be interested in that debate. Every conference, every seminar, every lecture has been packed out. I was down in the southwest Liskeard. To be frank, it's a lovely place I didn't know existed. On 3 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon, 300 people in a hall talking about the economy. That's about 10% of the population. There's a thirst now for understanding, and maybe we'll have the rational debate about Brexit in particular that we should have had before the referendum and didn't. Maybe we'll have it now. There's a thirst for understanding and knowledge, but people want to influence the agenda as well. So what we're doing in terms of the Labour Party is just opening the doors and just saying, tell us your ideas. We might not always agree, but when we disagree, it's got to be an informed disagreement. I think in that way, if the Labour Party now is listening again to people, is getting back to that sort of grassroots activity of reconnecting with the real world, yes, I think it will change that credibility, that gap that we've had since the crash in particular. But let me be absolutely clear, though, that credibility gap started in particular when the crash was in 2007, 2008, because Labour was in government. Every party that was in government at that point in time has suffered the same economic credibility gap. Now, what we've got to do now is not just solve the credibility gap of the Labour Party. I think we've got to solve the credibility gap of all political parties, and even the credibility gap of anyone who thinks they're an expert talking to people, because people have lost confidence in virtually all the establishment, all the experts. So our exercise of going around talking to people with our experts is to actually link them up with the real world experience of people. Because what the Brexit vote did in large amounts of the country, as I said in my speech, it gave the opportunity to people not even necessarily voting on that particular issue, but to give the system and the establishment a kick to say, this system is not working for us, do something about it. So all of us, I think, all of us, in whatever positions we are, we've got to start listening and we've got to start engaging with people in a way that hasn't been done for maybe a generation. That's the challenge for the Labour Party, but I think is a challenge for all of us. And to actually see you all here today in such large numbers, you recognise that challenge as well, because it is about making sure government and politicians and others connect with the real world. And as I've said in my speech, the real world in the future. If we're going to tackle this issue of inequality, if we're going to tackle this issue of confidence in our economic system, it is about rebuilding and transforming our economy. And the best way of doing that is to rebalance our economy and make sure that we rebuild it on the growth of manufacturing. Anyway, thanks for inviting me along. I hope it gave you some stimulation for thought as well as it certainly has me in terms of the questions. Thank you very much.